Hey everyone, welcome to my channel from start to now. If you love uncovering hidden stories from history, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss our future videos. Let's dive in. Imagine a land where humanity may have first learned to survive, to create, and to build civilization itself. A land of powerful African kingdoms that ruled long before Europe looked south. Rich in gold, diamonds, and culture, yet later scarred by one of the most brutal systems of racial oppression the modern world has ever known. Today, we're uncovering the hidden history of South Africa, a story of greatness, betrayal, suffering, resistance, and a long, painful fight for freedom. This isn't just history, this story is still alive. And once you hear it, South Africa will never look the same again. South Africa holds a place in human history that is far deeper and more powerful than many people realize, because this land is not just another chapter in the story of civilization. It is one of the places where that story may have first begun. Long before empires rose in Europe or cities spread across Asia, early human ancestors were already living, thinking, adapting, and surviving in southern Africa. Archaeological discoveries from places like the cradle of humankind show evidence of early hominins dating back millions of years, suggesting that the foundations of human intelligence, creativity, and social behavior were shaped on this very soil. These early humans were not simply wandering aimlessly. They learned how to use tools, control fire, cooperate in groups, and pass knowledge from one generation to the next. This makes South Africa not just a location on a map, but a birthplace of humanity itself, a land where the earliest steps toward modern human life were taken. As thousands of years passed, these early communities evolved into more structured societies. People learned to farm, domesticate animals, and settle in stable communities. Language, culture, and belief systems developed, forming identities that were deeply connected to the land. These societies understood their environment in ways that allowed them to thrive despite harsh climates and limited resources. They developed systems of leadership, conflict resolution, and trade that kept their communities strong and united. Far from being isolated or undeveloped, Southern Africa was a region of movement, exchange, and innovation, connected to other parts of the continent through migration and trade. One of the strongest proofs of Africa's early greatness lies in the rise of ancient kingdoms, especially the kingdom of Mapungubwe. Flourishing around the 11th century, Mapungubwe was a powerful state that controlled key trade routes linking southern Africa to the Indian Ocean world. Gold mined and crafted in this region traveled to distant lands, reaching merchants in Arabia, India, and even China. This alone challenges the outdated idea that Africa existed outside global history before European contact. Mapungubwe had a clear social hierarchy, with leaders who ruled from elevated areas, symbolizing political and spiritual authority. The people were skilled farmers, metalworkers, and traders, producing goods that were valuable far beyond their borders. The famous golden artifacts discovered at Mapungubwe, including the golden rhinoceros, reflect not only wealth but also artistic sophistication and symbolic thinking. These were not accidental achievements. They were the result of centuries of accumulated knowledge and cultural development. The kingdom eventually declined, likely due to environmental changes and shifting trade routes, but its legacy remains a powerful reminder that African civilizations rose, flourished, and influenced the world long before colonization. Beyond Mapungubwe, many other societies shaped the region's history. The ancestors of the Zulu, Xhosa, Sotho, Tswana, and other groups built communities based on shared ancestry, land, and tradition. Leadership was often tied to responsibility rather than absolute power, and land was seen as communal rather than something to be owned by individuals. oral history played a crucial role in preserving knowledge, passing down stories of origins, heroes, and moral values through generations. These traditions ensured that history lived in people's voices, not just in written records. Military organization and strategic thinking were also present long before European arrival. Communities developed ways to defend their land and resolve conflicts, and some, like the later Zulu kingdom, would become renowned for their discipline and tactical innovation. This strength did not come from imitation of outsiders, but from internal development shaped by local realities and needs. Social bonds, respect for elders, and spiritual beliefs created strong foundations that held these societies together through times of change. What makes this history truly hidden is not that it never existed, but that it was deliberately ignored or minimized for centuries. Colonial narratives often portrayed Africa as empty, backward, or waiting to be discovered, which served to justify land seizure and domination. By erasing or downplaying ancient African achievements, colonizers could claim moral and intellectual superiority. But the truth tells a very different story, one where South Africa was already rich in culture, knowledge, and human potential long before foreign ships appeared on its shores. Understanding South Africa as one of the birthplaces of humanity changes how we view the entire history of the country. It reminds us that the people who later suffered under colonization and apartheid were descendants of innovators, builders, and leaders. Their struggle was not the beginning of their story, but a painful interruption of a much longer journey. When we acknowledge this deeper past, we begin to see South Africa not only as a land marked by oppression, but as a land of origin, resilience, and enduring human spirit, a place where the earliest chapters of our shared human story were written and remembered through generations who lived, dreamed, and built their world on African soil. The transformation of South Africa into a land of extreme inequality did not happen overnight, but through a long and deliberate process driven by colonization and the hunger for wealth that followed the discovery of precious resources. When European powers first arrived at the southern tip of Africa, their initial interest was strategic rather than permanent. The Cape was seen as a stopping point for ships traveling between Europe and Asia, a place to rest, resupply, and move on. But as settlements grew, so did the desire for land, control, and profit. What began as small trading outposts slowly evolved into colonial domination, fundamentally reshaping the lives of the people who had lived on this land for generations. As Dutch settlers expanded beyond the Cape, they pushed indigenous communities off fertile land and disrupted established systems of farming, grazing, and trade. Violence, forced labor, and treaties made under pressure became tools of expansion. When the British took control of the Cape in the early 19th century, colonial rule did not soften. Instead, it became more structured and far-reaching. Laws were introduced that favored European settlers and restricted the rights of African populations, laying early foundations for racial hierarchy. Land ownership increasingly became tied to race, with African communities confined to limited areas while settlers claimed the most productive regions. This imbalance deepened dramatically with the discovery of diamonds in Kimberley in the late 1860s. Almost overnight, South Africa became a global center of wealth and opportunity, attracting investors, fortune seekers, and colonial administrators eager to profit. Mining companies emerged, backed by European capital and political power. But the wealth extracted from the earth did not benefit the majority of the population. Instead, it flowed upward to a small white elite, while black South Africans were forced into exhausting and dangerous labor under harsh conditions. Men were separated from their families for months or years, housed in overcrowded compounds, and paid wages that barely sustained survival. The discovery of gold on the Witwatersrand soon after intensified this system of exploitation. Gold mining required a massive, controlled workforce, and colonial authorities responded by tightening laws that restricted the movement and rights of African people. Pass laws were enforced to monitor where black workers could live and travel, ensuring a steady supply of cheap labor for the mines. These laws criminalized everyday life, turning ordinary movement into an offense punishable by arrest. Economic growth and industrial development surged, but they were built on the systematic suppression of black lives and labor. As wealth poured in, cities expanded, infrastructure developed, and South Africa became one of the richest economies in Africa. Yet this prosperity was deeply unequal. White settlers enjoyed modern housing, education, healthcare, and political power, while black communities were pushed into overcrowded townships and rural reserves with limited access to basic services. The economy depended on this imbalance. Cheap black labor was essential to keeping profits high, and the state actively protected this system through legislation and force. Colonization also reshaped social relationships and cultural identities. Traditional systems of land use and communal living were disrupted as land was privatized and fenced off. African farmers struggled to compete with settler agriculture, which was supported by government policies and access to resources. Taxes were imposed on African households, forcing men to seek wage labor in mines and cities to survive. This not only weakened local economies, but also fractured family and community structures, creating long-lasting social consequences. By the early 20th century, racial inequality was no longer just an outcome of colonization. It was embedded into the legal and economic framework of the country. Laws such as the 1913 Natives Land Act formalized land dispossession by restricting black South Africans to a small fraction of the country's land, despite being the majority population. This single act ensured generational poverty and cemented white economic dominance. Wealth generated from land, minerals, and industry continued to benefit a minority, while millions were denied opportunities to build stable futures. The mining industry became a symbol of both progress and suffering. While it fueled South Africa's rise as a global economic power, it also exposed workers to extreme danger, disease, and exploitation. Accidents were common, safety standards were minimal, and workers had little legal protection. Resistance was often met with violence, as the state and corporations worked together to suppress strikes and protests. Profit mattered more than human life, and inequality deepened with every ounce of gold extracted. This system of exploitation did more than create economic gaps. It shaped the mindset of the nation. Wealth became associated with race, and poverty was treated as a natural condition rather than the result of deliberate policy. Generations grew up under a system that normalized injustice, making inequality appear inevitable. By the time apartheid was formally introduced in 1948, the foundation had already been laid through decades of colonial rule and resource-driven exploitation. Understanding this history is essential to understanding modern South Africa. The extreme inequality seen today did not emerge by accident or personal failure, but through centuries of calculated decisions that prioritized profit and power over humanity. Colonization and the discovery of gold and diamonds did not simply bring development. They created a system where wealth for a few was built on the suffering of many, a system whose consequences are still felt in the social and economic landscape of South Africa. Today, apartheid was far more than prejudice or social separation. It was a carefully engineered system designed to control every aspect of life based entirely on race, and it functioned with chilling precision. When it was formally introduced in 1948, it did not appear out of nowhere. It was the result of decades of laws, attitudes, and economic interests that had already positioned white South Africans at the top of society, while pushing black South Africans to the margins. Apartheid took these existing inequalities and turned them into a rigid legal structure, ensuring that racial dominance was not only practiced but enforced by the state, the police, the courts, and the education system. At the heart of apartheid was classification. Every person in South Africa was legally defined by race, categorized as white, black, colored, or Indian. This single label determined almost everything about a person's life. It decided where you could live, which schools you could attend, what jobs you were allowed to hold, who you could marry, and even which hospitals you could use. Families were sometimes split apart when members were classified differently, creating emotional wounds that lasted for generations. Identity was no longer something shaped by culture or community, but something imposed by government officials using appearance, ancestry, and arbitrary criteria. Residential segregation was one of the most visible and devastating aspects of apartheid. Laws such as the Group Areas Act forced millions of black South Africans out of their homes, often with little notice or compensation. Entire neighborhoods were demolished, and people were relocated to distant townships with poor infrastructure, limited services, and few economic opportunities. These forced removals were not accidental side effects. They were deliberate strategies to keep black populations far from economic centers while reserving the best land and resources for whites. The trauma of losing one's home, community, and sense of belonging became a shared experience for millions. Education under apartheid was designed not to empower, but to limit. The Bantu education system ensured that black children received an inferior education tailored to prepare them only for manual labor and low-skilled jobs. Schools were underfunded, overcrowded, and deliberately restricted in curriculum. Subjects that encouraged critical thinking or ambition were discouraged. The message was clear and cruel. Black South Africans were not meant to dream beyond servitude. This denial of quality education robbed generations of opportunity and reinforced the economic imbalance that apartheid depended upon. Economic control was another central pillar of the system. Job reservation laws protected skilled and high-paying positions for white workers, while black workers were confined to the most dangerous, exhausting, and lowest-paid jobs. Trade unions for black workers were restricted or banned, leaving them with little power to negotiate wages or working conditions. Past laws further controlled movement, requiring black South Africans to carry identification documents at all times. Failure to produce these documents could result in arrest, fines, or imprisonment, turning daily life into a constant state of fear and surveillance. Social life under apartheid was equally regulated. Public spaces such as parks, beaches, buses, and even benches were segregated. Signs declaring whites only became symbols of humiliation and exclusion. Relationships across racial lines were criminalized, and people could be imprisoned simply for loving someone classified as a different race. These laws aimed not only to separate bodies, but to reinforce the idea that races should never mix, never share, and never see each other as equals. The enforcement of apartheid relied heavily on violence and intimidation. Police were given sweeping powers to detain, interrogate, and suppress dissent. Peaceful protests were often met with brutality, arrests, and death. State security forces monitored activists, censored media, and banned organizations that challenged the system. Fear became a tool of governance, used to silence opposition and maintain control. Yet even in this climate of repression, resistance never disappeared. What made apartheid especially destructive was how it normalized injustice. Because discrimination was written into law, cruelty became routine and bureaucratic. Officials could claim they were simply following regulations, while the system quietly destroyed lives. Poverty, overcrowding, and lack of opportunity were framed as natural conditions rather than consequences of policy. This normalization allowed many beneficiaries of the system to distance themselves from its human cost, while those suffering under it were blamed for their own oppression. Apartheid also inflicted deep psychological damage. Being told daily that you were inferior, unworthy, or invisible left scars that could not be measured by statistics alone. Dignity was constantly attacked, from the language people were forced to use to the way they were treated in public spaces. Children grew up internalizing messages about their supposed limitations, while parents struggled to protect their families in a system designed to break them apart. The damage extended beyond individuals, shaping collective trauma that would persist long after apartheid's legal end. By the time apartheid began to crumble in the late 20th century, its effects were deeply embedded in every layer of South African society. Ending the laws did not automatically undo the harm they caused. Economic inequality, spatial segregation, and social divisions remained powerful reminders of how thoroughly apartheid had reshaped the nation. Understanding apartheid as a system rather than simple discrimination is essential because it reveals how injustice can be engineered, maintained, and defended through law, ideology, and force, leaving behind consequences that echo long after the system itself is dismantled. Resistance. Oppression in South Africa was not a single moment or a single movement, but a continuous force that flowed through generations, adapting its form while holding on to the same demand for dignity and freedom. From the earliest days of colonial rule, African communities resisted land dispossession, forced labor, and the erosion of their way of life. Chiefs, warriors, workers, students, and ordinary citizens all played roles in defying systems that sought to dominate them. This resistance did not always look the same, and it was never easy, but it never truly stopped, even when the cost was imprisonment, exile, or death. In the early years of organized resistance, many leaders believed deeply in peaceful methods as the most powerful path toward change. They used petitions, delegations, strikes, and nonviolent protests to appeal to the conscience of those in power. Organizations such as the African National Congress emerged with the aim of uniting oppressed people across ethnic and regional lines. Leaders like Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, and Walter Sisulu believed that justice could be achieved through dialogue, legal challenge, and mass mobilization. They placed their faith in the idea that moral pressure and collective action could force the system to change. However, the state's response to peaceful resistance was often brutal. Demonstrations were met with police violence, arrests, and bans on political organizations. The Sharpeville Massacre in 1960 marked a turning point that shattered any remaining illusion that the apartheid regime would respond to peaceful protest with reform. When unarmed protesters were gunned down for opposing pass laws, it became clear to many that nonviolence alone would not protect lives or secure freedom. In the face of this reality, the resistance movement evolved, with some leaders concluding that armed struggle was a necessary response to state violence. Nelson Mandela's role during this period became one of the most powerful symbols of resistance in modern history. Once a strong advocate of peaceful protest, he helped establish a militant wing of the liberation movement, believing that sabotage against symbols of oppression was a way to apply pressure without targeting civilians. His arrest and life sentence were meant to crush the movement and serve as a warning to others. Instead, Mandela's imprisonment transformed him into a global icon. Behind prison walls, he became a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and unbreakable resolve, representing the millions whose voices had been silenced. While prominent leaders were imprisoned or forced into exile, resistance inside South Africa continued to grow. Workers organized strikes despite severe punishment. Communities formed underground networks to support activists and spread information. Students became a driving force of resistance, refusing to accept an education system designed to limit their future. The Soweto Uprising of 1976, led by young people protesting against the language imposed in schools, shocked the nation and the world. The image of children facing armed police exposed the moral bankruptcy of apartheid and reignited global outrage. The struggle also extended beyond South Africa's borders. Exiled activists built international networks, lobbying governments, organizations, and individuals to take action. Cultural resistance played a crucial role, with musicians, writers, and artists using their platforms to expose injustice and inspire solidarity. Sports and cultural boycotts isolated South Africa, sending a clear message that apartheid would not be tolerated by the global community. Economic sanctions increased pressure on the government, making it harder to sustain the system financially and politically. Inside the country, repression intensified as the government attempted to hold on to power. States of emergency were declared, giving security forces sweeping authority to detain, censor, and intimidate. Yet every attempt to silence opposition seemed to strengthen the determination of those resisting. Ordinary people became heroes in their own quiet ways, hiding activists, sharing information, and refusing to cooperate with unjust laws. Resistance became woven into daily life, not just in dramatic confrontations, but in small acts of defiance that kept hope alive. What made the resistance movement remarkable was its resilience and adaptability. When one path was blocked, another emerged. When leaders were imprisoned, new voices rose. When fear was used as a weapon, solidarity became a shield. The movement was not without internal conflict or debate, but its core purpose remained clear: the belief that no system built on injustice could last forever. This belief sustained people through decades of struggle, loss, and uncertainty. As the apartheid state grew weaker under internal unrest and external pressure, the role of resistance became undeniable. Negotiations in the late 1980s and early 1990s were not acts of generosity by those in power, but the result of relentless pressure from a population that refused to be broken. Nelson Mandela's release from prison symbolized not only personal freedom, but the triumph of collective resistance. It showed that sacrifice, unity, and perseverance could bend even the most rigid systems. The story of resistance in South Africa is ultimately a story of ordinary people achieving extraordinary change. It reminds us that freedom is rarely given willingly by those who hold power, but won through courage, persistence, and shared struggle. The global recognition of figures like Nelson Mandela should never overshadow the countless unnamed individuals whose actions made change possible, because it was the combined force of peaceful protest, armed resistance, international solidarity, and everyday defiance that finally brought apartheid to its knees. The transition of South Africa from apartheid to democracy stands as one of the most remarkable and emotionally complex transformations in modern history, not because it erased the pain of the past, but because it chose a path that prioritized reconciliation over revenge. After decades of institutionalized cruelty, violence, and humiliation, the country stood at a crossroads where anger could easily have led to civil war. Many believed that the wounds were too deep, the memories too painful, and the divisions too severe for peaceful change to be possible. Yet South Africa surprised the world by demonstrating that forgiveness and unity, while difficult and imperfect, could become powerful tools for national healing. When apartheid began to collapse, the atmosphere was filled with uncertainty and fear. Communities that had lived under constant tension now faced the challenge of building a shared future with those who had benefited from their oppression. The release of Nelson Mandela after 27 years in prison became a defining moment, not just because a man was freed, but because of the message he carried. Instead of calling for retaliation, Mandela spoke of reconciliation, understanding, and coexistence. This choice required immense moral strength, especially from someone who had personally endured so much injustice. His words signaled a shift in the struggle, from defeating an enemy to rebuilding a nation. The first democratic elections in 1994 marked a historic turning point. For the first time, South Africans of all races stood in long lines, some waiting for hours, to cast a vote that had been denied to them their entire lives. The atmosphere was charged with emotion, hope, and disbelief. This moment was not simply a political event, it was a reclaiming of dignity and voice. The peaceful nature of the elections defied expectations and showed that a society long divided by law and fear could choose a different future. However, democracy did not magically erase the legacy of apartheid. The new government inherited a deeply unequal society, where wealth, land, and opportunity were still concentrated in the hands of a minority. Recognizing this, South Africa took a unique approach to addressing past crimes through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Instead of focusing solely on punishment, the Commission aimed to uncover the truth about human rights abuses committed under apartheid. Victims were given a platform to share their experiences, while perpetrators were offered amnesty in exchange for full disclosure. This process was painful and controversial, but it allowed the nation to confront its past openly rather than bury it in silence. Reconciliation was not about forgetting or excusing injustice. It was about acknowledging harm and creating space for healing. For many victims, telling their stories publicly was an act of empowerment, a way to reclaim humanity in a system that had denied it. For the nation, it was a collective reckoning that challenged denial and forced difficult conversations. The process revealed that healing is not linear and that forgiveness cannot be demanded, only offered. Yet even in its imperfections, it prevented widespread cycles of revenge that could have torn the country apart. Unity became both an aspiration and a daily challenge. South Africans were encouraged to see themselves not as enemies separated by race, but as citizens of a shared nation. Symbols of division were replaced with efforts to build inclusive identities, from a new national flag to a constitution that enshrined equality and human rights. The idea of the Rainbow Nation captured the hope of diversity coexisting without domination. While reality often fell short of this ideal, the vision itself played a crucial role in shaping the country's direction. The legacy of reconciliation can still be seen in South Africa's political culture and global reputation. The country became a symbol of peaceful transition, offering lessons to other nations grappling with conflict and division. Leaders and activists around the world studied South Africa's experience as proof that dialogue and compromise, though difficult, could prevent bloodshed and create pathways to justice. This did not mean that South Africa became free of problems. Poverty, inequality, and social tension remain significant challenges, reminding the world that reconciliation is a process rather than an end point. What makes South Africa's transition especially powerful is that it was driven not only by leaders, but by ordinary people who chose restraint over rage. Communities that had suffered immensely resisted the urge to seek violent retribution, understanding that lasting freedom required stability and cooperation. This choice was not born out of weakness, but out of wisdom and exhaustion from endless conflict. It reflected a deep understanding that true victory lies not in destroying an enemy, but in creating conditions where future generations can live without fear. The story of South Africa's reconciliation reminds us that history does not always have to repeat itself.